Good afternoon. Warm welcome to our briefing on Myanmar. Warm welcome to our guest in person and also to our virtual audience. My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Latin American Conflict Security and Development. I'm also the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, which is one of the flagship publications of the IISS, which provides an exhaustive strategic analysis of active conflict across the world. Today's event is part of a IISS Conflict Briefing bi-monthly series, which builds on the findings of the report to provide our audience of practitioners and experts with a clear, structured, and comprehensive information about active conflict across the world through insight from eminent experts, as is the case today. The February 2021 coup in Myanmar has transformed the conflict dynamics in the country, escalating and expanding armed violence to a scale unprecedented since the country independence in 1948, as you all know. The Central Plains, where violence has been absent for decades, have now become central to the conflict. Also, while violence has continued to spike in most of the country's ethnic minority states, the Rakhine state has seen an uneasy truce since the coup. There have been lots of movement and changes in the violence trends in the country, and many interesting and very worrisome trends. To discuss the conflict dynamics, the trends, the international repercussion and outlook, I'm joined today by two great experts of Myanmar. My colleague Connelly, who is Senior Fellow for Southeast Asian Politics and Foreign Policy, is based normally in our Singapore office. His research focuses on Indonesia, Myanmar, ASEAN, and US policy in the region. Prior to joining the IISS, Arun was the first director of the Southeast Asia project at the Loong Institute in Sydney. Early in his career, he was also a Fulbright scholar and visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. Dr. Shona Loong is senior researcher and lecturer in the Department of Geography at the University of Zurich. Her research focuses on conflict transformation, peace building, and the politics of international development. Shona has published with leading peer-reviewed journals, Political Geography and Geoforum. She has written and edited for various think tanks, international organizations, and non-profit entities. Shona holds a DPhil in geography from Oxford. Welcome, and thanks for being with us. Before we start, some quick housekeeping rules. As you may have noticed, this is a hybrid event with virtual participation. So after Shona and Arun's presentation, we will move into Q&As, which we hope will be as interactive and dynamic as possible. So please ask plenty of questions. For people joining us virtually, you can either type your questions on the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, or you can also raise your virtual hands if you prefer to ask your question directly. So please do so if you wish, and we will unmute your microphone. So with that, let's get started. Arun and Shona, over to you.
Thanks, Irene, and thank you all for joining us today. The Myanmar Conflict Map was launched in June of 2022 as a tool for tracking, visualizing, and analyzing reports of violence in Myanmar. It builds on a database of over 15,000 reports of violence in Myanmar over the last 2 years, collected by our partners at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, better known as ACLED. The map pulls out of the data specific conflict dynamics and isolates a set of 6 theaters, which we hope will provide a framework for understanding what may seem like indistinct violence from afar. My partners in this effort are Dr. Shona Loong of the University of Zurich and Brodie Smith. Brodie, who is not here today, has been an integral part of the team from data analysis to programming and design, and Shona is the author of a series of 5 written analyses, zooming in on specific theaters or warscapes in the map, 3 of which she will survey in a moment. These analyses show how the conflict is deeply rooted in long-standing political, economic, and social dynamics specific to various states and regions. But first, let's return to the 1st of February 2021, when Senior General Min Aung Hlaing seized power in Myanmar, to examine how the conflict began. The State Administration Council Junta, which he leads, immediately faced nonviolent resistance on a scale not seen in decades. Much of the civil service went on strike as part of what became known as the civil disobedience movement, crippling basic functions of the state. Street protests attracted tens of thousands, most of them young people who had come of age during 10 years of liberalization, beginning in 2011. When the Tatmadaw, as the Myanmar armed forces call themselves, suppressed the protests through violent crackdowns, opponents of the coup turned to armed resistance. It is not possible to provide an in-depth discussion of conflict dynamics in Myanmar in just 15 minutes, but I would like to turn to Shona now, who will provide at least a glimpse into the geography of Myanmar's resistance in 3 of our 6 war escapes, the Dry Zone, Rakhine, and Southeast Myanmar, which are all distinct yet interconnected. Shona?
The conflict map classifies actors into 3 groups, SAC, or State Administration Council forces, anti-SAC forces, and ethnic armed organizations, or EAOs. So SAC forces refer to the Tatmadaw and its known allies, including proxy militias. As we can see on this map, the SAC is fighting battles all across Myanmar, and its capabilities are stretched as a result. Anti-SAC forces are those formed after the 2021 coup, primarily interested in toppling the military regime. The most prominent set of actors here are People's Defense Forces, or PDFs. PDFs are small cells of people who oppose the coup using arms, who began to organize on a local basis, using violence against regime soldiers, military-linked infrastructure, and supporters of the regime. Myanmar's shadow government, the National Unity Government, or NUG, has sought to bring PDFs under a unified chain of command, although in reality, PDFs have varied and loose relationships with the NUG. Nonetheless, PDFs in some areas, particularly Chin State and Connelly State, have become larger and increasingly organized over the past year. Third, we have ethnic armed organizations, or EAOs. These are armed groups that represent non-Burma ethnicities. They mostly predate the coup by decades and control territories close to Myanmar's borders, where they run administrative and political institutions for populations that have had limited contact with previous central governments. EAOs' responses to the coup have varied. In particular, EAOs have taken the emergence of PDFs into consideration in calculating whether to press the SAC on the battlefield. To date, no EAOs have fought PDFs. In some parts of Myanmar, like Kachin State and Karen State, EAOs and PDFs have established relationships and fight together against the SAC. Other EAOs, however, are mistrustful of both the junta and the wider resistance movement. Smaller EAOs have sought to secure autonomy, either through dialogue with the regime. Others have stepped up their clashes against the SAC, while some have abstained from battle altogether. Besides this, the conflict map shows violent events unclaimed by any actor. There have been more than 3,000 incidents of unattributed violence, predominantly explosions, since the coup. These encompass 22% of all violent events. There are likely to be many unreported events too. In part, this is because of the immense dangers faced by journalists, as well as the junta's use of internet blocks as a counterinsurgency strategy. Our talk today will focus on 3 warscapes and how SAC forces, anti-SAC forces, and EAOs shape conflict dynamics in each. The conflict map shows that since the coup, armed violence has occurred in 94% of Myanmar's townships. But while the war is widespread, it is also uneven. This is because the resistance to the coup is layered over older struggles that predated, primarily dynamics between EAOs and the Tatmadaw in various ethnic areas. Our conflict map and accompanying commentary series provide a deep dive into 6 warscapes: the Dry Zone, Rakhine, Northeast Myanmar, Southeast Myanmar, Northwest Myanmar, and Lower Myanmar, and the conflict dynamics in each. Our talk today will focus on 3: the Dry Zone, Rakhine, and the Southeast. Our commentary series began with the Dry Zone, which is pivotal to the countrywide conflict for 2 reasons. Firstly, the Dry Zone's inhabitants had not witnessed widespread armed violence since Myanmar's independence. Secondly, the Dry Zone is known as the heartland of Burma Buddhism, with the Tatmadaw now fighting PDFs organized in the Dry Zone. The conflict there is depriving Tatmadaw of a central source of legitimacy, its claims to preserving Burmese nationhood. One tactic that the SAC has used against the Dry Zone's population is the systemic razing of houses suspected of sheltering insurgents. By June 2022, the UNHCR reported that an estimated 337,000 people had been displaced in Sagaing alone. As we can see over here, infrastructure destruction, including SAC arson, is concentrated in Myanmar's Dry Zone. The SAC's scorched earth policy is also significant because it was used punitively against EAOs between the 1980s and 2000s, when they refused to accede to the Tatmadaw's demands. Before the coup, the Tatmadaw explained this counterinsurgency strategy by citing a need to preserve Myanmar's national unity against fractious elements, namely the most belligerent EAOs. The SAC is now using similar tactics against the Dry Zone's Burma Buddhist population. Increasingly, the SAC appears to see itself as a class apart from the rest of the population, including its Burma Buddhist majority. Now, we move on to another warscape, Rakhine, where a curious calm prevailed after the coup, in contrast to an increase in armed violence throughout the rest of Myanmar. The Arakan Army, or the AA, and the Tatmadaw agreed to an informal truce in November 2020, 4 months before the coup, bringing nearly 2 years of intense fighting to an end. The AA, associated with the Rakhine ethnic group, was then described as the most formidable opponent the Tatmadaw had faced in years. However, an initial absence in conflict in Rakhine was not tantamount to a lack of tension between the Tatmadaw and the AA. Rather, this reflected the AA's relative strength in comparison to other EAOs, and also its determination to chart its own course towards Rakhine sovereignty, rather than latch onto the wider resistance movement. Relations between the SAC and the AA are not only poor, but have been worsening, as the AA seeks to consolidate its control over much of Rakhine state. In late July this year, conflict returned to Rakhine. The AA's deputy commander-in-chief has described this as the final war for building the state of Arakan. The flare-up in conflict has ensnared civilians. At the start of this month, the UN in Myanmar stated that 174,000 people had been displaced in Rakhine since August, and that humanitarian aid was being disrupted by new movement restrictions. Rohingya, of whom 600,000 remain in camps in Myanmar, are reportedly trapped between the AA and the Tatmadaw, as both forces look on the Rohingya with suspicion. The conflict in Rakhine has marched to a different beat than in the rest of Myanmar. It illustrates both the strengths of cartographic representations of the war, like the conflict map, as well as their limits. On the one hand, the conflict map shows how, when conflict was flaring up elsewhere in Myanmar, Rakhine remains staunchly calm. But on the other hand, we cannot show, using violent event data, how the AA was seeking to expand and deepen its control during that period. Conversely, in Southeast Myanmar, armed conflict flared up almost immediately after the coup. The Southeast is notable and distinctive because of a close relationship between the NUG, National Unity Government, PDFs, and local EAOs, namely the Karen National Union, or KNU, and the Karenni National Progressive Party, or KNPP. Both the KNU and KNPP were among the first to denounce the coup, and then to match their words with military action, and thereafter to openly support the NUG. The KNU and KNPP are also remarkable for their extensive cooperation with proximate PDFs, training them, supplying them, and in the KNU's case, incorporating them under a joint command structure. The cooperation between EAOs and Myanmar's democratic resistance has had a long history in the Southeast. In 2021, the anti-coup movement and the rise of the NUG and PDFs alongside offered the KNU and KNPP the chance to participate in countrywide struggles for federal democracy once more. While cooperation has not been without friction, the close cooperation between EAOs and other anti-SAC actors distinguishes the Southeast from other warscapes in Myanmar. This borderland is critical not only to the KNU and KNPP, but to broader efforts to weave together the Myanmar struggles for democracy and EAO-led struggles for self-determination. The Tatmadaw has responded accordingly. Townships in the Southeast, particularly the Dimoso stronghold of the KNPP and parts of Papun and Myawaddy townships on the Thai border held by the KNU, are among the top 5 targets for Tatmadaw airstrikes since the coup. This has driven displacement of civilians and fighters, including many who have crossed the border into Thailand. So I'd like to conclude with some general reflections on what taking apart these warscapes and then putting them back together can tell us about Myanmar. Firstly, by dividing actors into 4 groups, SAC, anti-SAC, EAOs, and unattributed actors, and showing how they act in different configurations in each warscape, the conflict map makes clear that the current civil war is not a binary contest between the SAC and anti-SAC forces. Keeping the varied aspirations and challenges faced by these actors in mind allows for a clearer assessment of the conflict in Myanmar. It recognizes Myanmar's demographic and geographic diversity and how the current struggle is not just about overthrowing the coup, but about how to accommodate deep divisions in society, which were often the product of the Tatmadaw's divide and rule strategies in the past. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the conflict map makes visible more than 3,000 unattributed violent events. The scale of unattributed violence is a reminder that the conflict in Myanmar is a struggle over information as much as a struggle over territory, resources, and rights. Secondly, by displaying changes in the types of violent events over time, the conflict map tracks the evolution of Myanmar's conflict. This makes clear that the SAC has been unable to maintain stability in most parts of the country. Since October 2021, Myanmar has witnessed above 900 violent events every month, predominantly armed clashes and remote explosions. Notably, the conflict has not abated over the rainy season. Thirdly, a deep dive into each warscape shows that Myanmar is not, as narratives of a failed state would suggest, a zone of undifferentiated chaos. There are deep-rooted reasons why various groups struggle against the state in various ways, which must be addressed. Calls for the cessation of violence, as various international actors have responded to the crisis, fall flat because they do not address the root causes of violence, which stretch far further back than the coup in 2021. These root causes are again differentiated by geography, but also interrelated. Finally, by drawing attention to the varied and entrenched roots of the conflict in Myanmar, the conflict map shows that decades-old disagreements and tensions cannot be overcome in months. Nevertheless, people have taken to the streets and then taken up arms in historic numbers. It is important to keep both these facts in mind, both the difficulties of forging alliances in a country where divisions have long existed and long been exploited by the Tatmadaw, as well as unprecedented unity against the SAC today. So now I'll just turn it over to Aaron to conclude with some discussions of the diplomatic aspects of the crisis.
Thanks, Shona. I'll stop sharing our screen here and we can come back to the map for questions a little bit later about some of the specific conflict dynamics. Although we initially planned to focus almost entirely on the conflict map during this briefing, there have been a number of developments since we began to plan it that we thought were important to address, especially in the IISS context, given our focus on the international diplomacy around armed violence in particular. And 2 meetings that I'd like to flag for you. The first is next week on October 27th. It's an extraordinary meeting of ASEAN foreign ministers at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. This is highly unusual. Something like it did take place last year. At that time, it was called an emergency meeting of the ASEAN foreign ministers. They're not using the emergency nomenclature this time because they've planned it in advance. They know they need to discuss Myanmar's future in ASEAN. And that is intended to set up a discussion at the ASEAN summit next month in Phnom Penh, where the leaders of ASEAN, all 9 of them, because Min Aung Hlaing, the leader of the SAC, has been excluded, and the NUG has not been invited to attend. They will discuss how they will handle this problem within ASEAN going forward. I think there are a few different ways that ASEAN could handle this, but it might be worth first revisiting the ASEAN 5-point consensus. So in April of 2021, ASEAN had a very unusual meeting at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, in which all 9 ASEAN leaders and Min Aung Hlaing were in attendance, and they agreed to something called the 5-point consensus. The 5-point consensus, which was first cessation of violence in Myanmar, 2, constructive dialogue amongst all parties toward a peaceful solution in the interests of the people, 3, that an ASEAN special envoy would facilitate that dialogue, 4, the provision of humanitarian assistance, and then 5, that the special envoy would visit Myanmar and meet with all parties concerned. And it was understood that that meant and included Aung San Suu Kyi. That 5-point consensus, which was agreed in April 2021, has come under extraordinary criticism since then, because Myanmar has failed to meet any of the commitments that it made as part of the 5-point consensus. In fact, immediately after Min Aung Hlaing returned to Yangon and to Naypyidaw that week, he or the SAC issued a statement in the New Light of Myanmar, the state newspaper, to the effect that it would not implement the 5-point consensus. It would continue to follow its own path. And despite efforts by first Brunei and now Cambodia as chair of ASEAN to get Myanmar, the SAC to implement those commitments, there's been almost no progress. Some in ASEAN will claim that there has been some humanitarian assistance delivered to Myanmar through the SAC, but that doesn't really amount to meaningful progress. I think given the debate about the 5-point consensus and its future, many have called for ASEAN to move past the 5-point consensus. It's worth keeping in mind that there are different visions of what the 5-point consensus represents within ASEAN. There are those mainly in the maritime countries, Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, at least under the previous government. We'll see what happens under the Marcos administration. There are those who see the 5-point consensus as effectively a binding agreement that the SAC made, which it is responsible for living up to, and which, if it doesn't live up to, there should be some consequences. There should be some penalty for the junta. There are also those within ASEAN, primarily in the mainland states, which tend to be more authoritarian in terms of their governance arrangements, who view the 5-point consensus, I think, not so much as a binding agreement, but rather as a platform for dialogue with the junta. And the fact that the junta has not lived up to those commitments for them is a problem to continue to work through, as opposed to one that requires a penalty for non-compliance. And in this, I'd compare the 5-point consensus for these countries to the way that ASEAN negotiates the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. For those of you who are not experts in the South China Sea, ASEAN has been negotiating a Code of Conduct with China in the South China Sea for over 20 years. In fact, this is the 20th anniversary of the beginning of those negotiations. And I think there is not actually a very realistic expectation on the part of most ASEAN member states that China is going to, in good faith, negotiate a code of conduct, which it will then live up to. And I believe that some of these ASEAN countries, although they wouldn't put it quite this way, see the 5-point consensus in a similar way. The Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, the negotiations around it, are meant to engage China in dialogue, hoping that it will moderate Chinese behavior so long as they're at the table. In the same way, I think they hope that the SAC moderates its behavior so long as ASEAN continues to engage in dialogue. So there are different visions within ASEAN about what's required now that we know that the SAC doesn't intend to live up to the 5-point consensus. But I think over the last 18 months, and next week is the 18-month anniversary of the 5-point consensus, all ASEAN member states, including the mainland states, are moving closer toward the maritime view of the 5-point consensus and moving closer to a harder line against the SAC, and are more prepared than they have been to take punitive action against the junta, partly just out of extraordinary embarrassment at the things that the junta has done. We don't need to go in this particular briefing into the details of some of the really some of the grotesque details of the atrocities that have been committed, particularly in the dry zone. There was one instance this week in which a teacher teaching at an NUG school was beheaded and had his head displayed as an intimidatory tactic. But these sorts of things are occurring on a regular basis in the dry zone and in some of the ethnic states as well. And that has caused a great deal of embarrassment, even in the mainland states, and they are now prepared to take action in a way that they weren't. There was a sign of this in August when ASEAN foreign ministers met in Phnom Penh, and in the earlier version of that meeting in 2021, those ASEAN foreign ministers, there was a real debate between the mainland states and the maritime states. The mainland states bracketing a lot of text in a joint statement that they were negotiating. That didn't happen at all this year. Thailand, which had defended the junta in the past, did not defend the junta in August in Phnom Penh. And so there's a question as to whether or not even Thailand is moving away from defending the junta and its position advocating engagement with the junta. There is their public position, which we heard at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June from Kun Pompimon Kanchanalak, the special advisor to the foreign minister, which is still very pro-engagement, but behind closed doors. Even Thailand, even Cambodia as chair, even Vietnam, they're all deeply frustrated with the junta and its non-compliance with the 5-point consensus. So I think there are a few possible outcomes from this meeting next week and from the ASEAN summit next month. The first possible outcome is that we could see a de facto suspension of Myanmar from ASEAN. ASEAN would never frame it as a suspension. They would merely leave Myanmar's seat at the table vacant until Myanmar could agree on the identity of the legitimate government of Myanmar. We saw a preview of this last year when Brunei did something similar in deciding not to invite Min Aung Hlaing to the summit that it held virtually at the annual ASEAN summit. Another possibility is we'll see further exclusions of SAC ministers from ASEAN dialogues. There is the ADMM Plus coming up in November as well. That's the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, where the ASEAN Defense Ministers meet with 8 counterparts from around the world, including the US, Russia, China. And there's an understandable reluctance on the part of Western countries to come to that meeting so long as the SAC is present. So we could see further exclusions from ASEAN mechanisms like that, short of a full de facto suspension. You might, for instance, see SAC economic ministers continue to attend economic meetings. And then finally, I think it's possible that we could see continued engagement with the junta, not particularly enthusiastic engagement, but we have seen, and Professor Julio Tihanki is here, and maybe he can share more about the Marcos administration's perspective on this. We did see President Bongbong Marcos in the Philippines say that he wanted to engage the junta recently. He seems to believe that perhaps he has some special touch that will unlock cooperation that his counterparts from around the region have yet to unlock. Let me just briefly speak about some of the other partners for Myanmar in the region, given that their relationship with ASEAN is in such poor condition. I think first, there's been a real misunderstanding about the SAC's relationship with China, which at the outset was very poor. Beijing had a very good relationship with the Aung San Suu Kyi government, was very happy with Aung San Suu Kyi's government, was doing a lot of work on infrastructure. They felt like it had created some stability in Myanmar that was advantageous to them. When Min Aung Hlaing came to power, he was known to Beijing as someone who was very anti-China, who had earned his reputation fighting militias on the eastern border of Myanmar, on the Chinese border, which have a very close relationship with Beijing and with actors in China. But over time, that relationship has improved. I think it's clear that Beijing has reconciled itself to the existence of a military government in Myanmar, but they do seem unhappy with Min Aung Hlaing as the leader of that government. And there may be some hope on the part of Beijing that the leader will change in the short to medium term, and that they will hold their nose with Min Aung Hlaing until they can find a better military leader. that hope may be in vain, but I think that is probably the direction that they are headed right now. Russia has been a very key partner of Myanmar. These are now two pariah states amongst the international community. They work very closely together. Russia is investing in energy infrastructure in Myanmar. Energy has become very expensive in Myanmar, like it has in many places, but there are added complications in a place like Myanmar. And of course, military aid. And that's been very important. But on the other hand, this is a very transactional relationship. It's not particularly close. And with Russia's problems, it's not clear how much they'll be able to do in the future to help Myanmar. And then finally, I'd point out India, which it doesn't get much attention, but has had a good relationship with the junta since the coup. That relationship is particularly important to the junta because while Thailand or China or Russia can't really provide the kind of international legitimacy that Min Aung Hlaing craves, India can. And if Myanmar holds elections next year, if I should say that SAC holds elections next year, as it has said it plans to do, I think this would do two things. First, it would split ASEAN. It seems clear that while ASEAN can remain relatively united last year and this year in terms of implementing the 5-point consensus or pushing Myanmar to implement it, I should say, it will be very difficult for ASEAN to hold together if Myanmar holds elections, because there are some member states like Thailand, Cambodia, who will want to then see what happens after the elections and hope that that represents some form of progress and may say that it should lead ASEAN to re-engage the junta. But I think the real wild card here is India. India has a long history of assisting semi-authoritarian regimes in holding elections and not really exercising any kind of judgment about the quality of those elections. And it sees a real interest in having an anti-China leader in Myanmar, preventing China from implementing projects that are in its interest on India's border. And so India may very well be a country that provides the kind of legitimacy that the junta seeks. And so I think that really will be a focus in the year to come, is what India does and how it responds to entreaties from Western countries and also like-minded countries in the Quad, Japan, Australia, the United States, to not engage with the junta on that election. So that's the prospectus for Myanmar and for international diplomacy on Myanmar. I think Shona and I are very interested in hearing from all of you, whether there are thoughts, whether there are comments or questions, and from the virtual audience, and hope to get a good discussion going. So thank you, Irene, for chairing, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Aaron. It was a fascinating overview, and I think there will be lots of questions on the outlook for peace, if I dare mention it. But given I'm the chair, I'm going to start. I'm going to use the prerogative for the first question. I think I would like to ask Shona a bit more details on the methodology used for the map, because it's really quite fascinating. And we were looking at the data moving and all the incredible detailed information there. I know you use, as Aaron mentioned, accurate data. So how did you work with it? What was the methodology behind it?
Yeah, thank you, Helena, for the question. So, of course, anyone can kind of go online and toggle the map if you like, and it's meant to be an interactive tool that people can use to gain new insights on the conflict in Myanmar. But as you said, we developed a map from data compiled by ARCLET, or the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And we were really striving for the best possible representation of conflict, in which, as we've mentioned, there are many information gaps. However, in this context, we thought that ARCLET provided the best, the best source of information for two reasons. I think the first is that it was regularly updated, as the map is, so we update it every month with new information in order to track kind of the real-time evolution of the conflict. But the second thing is that we knew that ARCLET was using a range of sources for their data, which included Burmese language sources, as well as ethnic language or minority language sources in Myanmar. And we felt that this was very important, given that Myanmar receives rather uneven coverage in the English language news. However, we did work with the ARCLET data. ARCLET itself classifies data into a few dozen subtypes, but we felt that in the context of Myanmar's crisis, it would do us best to classify these into 5 event types that we have identified. So just to give you an example of how we did that, ARCLET data has these subtypes called protest with intervention, mob violence, and violent demonstration. But when we looked into the data in each of these subtypes, we found that they actually indicated instances where the SAC was cracking down on protests in Myanmar. And so a name like violent demonstration is really not very apt to capture the asymmetrical nature of crackdowns and the fact that it's mainly perpetrated by the junta against civilians. And so we relabeled kind of data points in these event types under the heading crackdowns. The other reason we did that was to contribute to a larger discussion about Myanmar. And we wanted to use a vocabulary that would be familiar to an audience that was already engaging in some of these debates. And in the coverage in Myanmar, the word crackdowns comes up frequently, which is another reason why we chose to use it. Another thing that's important with this kind of map is that we're really looking at a township resolution map. So the townships are kind of the administrative subunit in Myanmar. The map doesn't pinpoint exactly where violence occurs, but rather shows the townships in which violence is the most extensive and the types of violence that occur in each township. So yeah, that's the methodology that we use for that.
Thanks, that's great to know. And I think we are also using the active data for the armed conflict survey, but it's actually really promising to see how much more you can do with that, with the right intellectual support and also knowledge. I will now open the floor for questions. We start with a question in the room. But please, for our virtual audience, if you want to ask questions, please feel free. I mean, it's like you were in the room with us, so don't be shy, please.
Gerard McCarthy at the LSE and Natural Resources Singapore that work on Myanmar and Southeast Asia. This is really interesting, and thank you for bringing together such a really deep and methodologically rich, as we just discussed, kind of data set. I had lots of questions and we can talk about them further, but I'll just focus on a couple of different areas. First is, suppose, what are your conclusions coming out of studying these conflict patterns about the strategic overreach of Thapador and sort of whether this level of conflict can be sustained? Obviously, we've gone through much of the rainy season in Myanmar, but we've also got an intensifying conflict theatre in Rakhine State. So sort of, I suppose, sort of from your sense of these conflict dynamics, how, you know, and I suppose part of what we didn't really talk about is the nature of different military deployments. So we've seen some evolution towards using these sort of light infantry deployments against some of these PDFs in recent months, and the movement of troops around the country. So maybe that's something that you guys have been considering alongside some of these reports, because the nature of the events were obviously different with different kind of deployments. That was just one question. And the second was, I suppose, this question about how, given ASEAN struggles with engaging with the Thapador, there was a sort of implicit agreement during 2021 amongst most international partners to engage through ASEAN, and especially from a humanitarian perspective, the ASEAN humanitarian sort of mission and initiative that was previously involved in Cyclone Nargis engagement in Myanmar, to mostly focus, I mean, I'm from Australia, and the Australian government mostly initially aligned themselves with the ASEAN humanitarian efforts. Given that ASEAN is now moving towards a more increasingly critical stance, which is already critical, do you see, you know, as conflict dynamics evolve, you know, new kind of conversation amongst donors about the need to engage with non-Myanmar military humanitarian actors, and especially some of the actors that Shona's been talking about, you know, the civil society kind of partners who've been engaging and providing services in Myanmar's sort of conflict zones for decades?
Yeah, thank you, Gerard, for the question. So I think the first thing I would say is that I think the map and the commentary series, we've tried to shy away from providing predictions, but I can kind of tell you perhaps what we've learned in the process of putting this together and also updating it in the last couple of months. It's really interesting. I was telling Aaron this morning that I think we launched the map at a time when the longevity of the conflict wasn't in doubt. And we really had to make the point that this conflict is here to stay. And now I think this is kind of accepted wisdom that Myanmar's conflict is entrenched and it will not kind of disappear, not even through dialogue, which has attempted and has failed. Two things I think regarding the longevity of the conflict, we see kind of in that chart on the left, that really, as you say, the conflict has not abated through the rainy season and things have continued apace in spite of kind of the difficulties that poses in terms of terrain and so on. I think the first is, of course, we can see kind of PDF's tenacity. Again, that is maybe not surprising to Myanmar watcher, but I feel that it was in doubt very much a couple of months ago. People are still willing to fight, and often at great cost. And even given the kinds of kind of rather grotesque acts that Aaron was mentioning earlier. But I think the second thing we've seen is also a digging in of heels from the SAC. And we see this both kind of reflected in the map, as well as upon reflection of how the current crisis relates to kind of past crises in Myanmar. The SAC is often kind of using an old playbook, albeit sometimes in new areas. So we talked about the dry zone and how arson has been a counterinsurgency tactic that the SAC has deployed time and time again. And using arson, it has never been able to entirely extinguish its opponents, and yet it's kind of digging its heels in and using that tactic further. Another tactic we see used again and again is the idea of kind of fragmenting the resistance or divide and rule. A few months ago, the SAC was inviting ethnic armed organizations to peace talks, hoping, in our view, I suppose, that this would mean that it was fighting on less fronts. However, it was, in my reading, mostly unsuccessful at quelling the conflict in this way, because most of the ethnic armed organizations that ended up going for these talks were rather insignificant in the larger scheme of things. And the largest ones that did go for talks, particularly the United War State Army, went for talks but sent a very low level, well, not a low level, but a relatively insignificant official. And in the end released a statement saying, this is a Burman problem, and we are not going to be associated with this. So we see time and time again the SAC kind of using old strategies rather than innovating on the battlefield. And I think that, again, means that to me, this is going to be repeated into the future.
I would just add one data point, which is that we hear some reports of differences within the Tomodaw in terms of strategy. Myanmar Conflict has chosen a strategy that has created an insurgency in the heart of Myanmar that Shona has detailed in a dry zone analysis, and that we'll look at further in the lower Myanmar theater analysis. There are those within the Tomodaw who think that this is a distraction from what they should really be doing, which is fighting ethnic armed groups. And that's what they've always done. It's what they're trained to do. It's what their logistics are set up to do. It's notable that, as Shona pointed out in our briefing in June at the SLP, the junta has raised militias in the dry zone to fight the PDFs there. As opposed to sending its crack light infantry division troops to the dry zone, and they've kept those mainly in ethnic states, because that appears to be where the core institutional Tomodaw continues to see the greatest threat, but also it's just what they know how to do. So that debate over strategy could have implications for Myanmar Conflict's continued leadership of the Tomodaw. If there is a core of the Tomodaw that believes that he has chosen a blind alley, it will increase pressure for him to go, maybe not right away, maybe not in a particularly violent way, but there may be additional pressure for him to give way to another leader that is more aligned with what the core institutional Tomodaw wants to do.
So we have a couple of questions online before we go back to the room. One question is around what we were discussing earlier on, what the election that has been at least announced for next year. What events could lead the junta to postpone the election, you think?
Aaron, feel free to add on. I think elections have long been controversial in Myanmar, and there has often been a history of kind of cancelled elections and postponed elections and so on. So to me, the first thing that comes to mind is simply using the fact of the conflict to postpone elections. If the SAC that thinks that that would extend its kind of stay in the hallways of power. And this tactic has already been used, most notably perhaps in Rakhine, where in past elections, the SAC has cancelled elections over most of Rakhine stage, citing the conflict there that flared up between 2018 and 2020.
I think on the international level, there's very little that the international community can do to persuade the junta to postpone the elections, even if, say, Thailand, India, Russia, and China, not terribly valuable in terms of election observers, but even if they were to not send election observers, and the international community were to coalesce around that response, I don't know that that would actually make that much of a difference in terms of its decision calculus in terms of whether it wants to hold an election. But I thought it was very interesting at our Myanmar panel at the Shangri-La Dialogue. We had the UN Special Envoy, UN Secretary General's Special Envoy, who said that she believed that the election, if it was held in August, as is widely believed to be the junta's plan, that it would be a flashpoint for greater violence and could lead to increased conflict. We expect attacks by PDFs and perhaps EAOs in some of the theaters that Shona has highlighted on both. And so that could actually be a flashpoint for further violence. I think much of ASEAN hopes that it will be a way of moving past the current violence, but in fact, it could accelerate that violence.
Interesting.
Question from the room? I just have a follow-up question about the methodology for the map. When using big data sets like Packet, it is sometimes difficult to identify the different actors and to put them in a cluster as you did. And so I wanted to ask what has been your approach to this particular challenge and how you have come up with a methodology to put the actors into clusters.
Thank you for the question. So essentially, I think on our end, we do the classification of the actors manually based on what we already know about Myanmar. So the EAOs, the ethnic armed organizations, they all predate, the coup. And so there's quite, I would say, a defined list, I suppose, of organizations that we can classify as EAOs. The challenge comes when kind of looking at the great many anti-SAC actors or people's defense forces that have emerged. And in those cases, we look to kind of media reports to try and understand who these actors are by individually kind of going down a list. And in that case, and that's how we kind of classify the actors.
Thank you.
I have two brief comments and a question. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the team for such a very interesting conflict map. I hope we also have one in the Philippines because we have the longest running Maoist insurgency in the world.
Yeah.
And it seems that will go on and on, just like this conflict in Myanmar. I'd like to comment on Aaron's statement about ASEAN. Of course, the Myanmar situation is one of the biggest crises to be faced by ASEAN in its existence. In fact, I would like to ask Aaron if he would consider this an existentialist crisis for ASEAN, because it really brings to light the strength of ASEAN, but at the same time, it's a fundamental weakness. The two principles of consensus and non-interference, right? So these two principles has allowed ASEAN to what we call in the Philippines dribble, because of the American influence in basketball, to dribble situations like this, such as the South China Sea Code of Conduct with China. But of course, it's a different situation here because human lives are concerned, or humanitarian consideration. So yeah, I would like to ask Aaron if this would actually, it would be interesting how the ASEAN leaders would handle this in the coming months, because it might really mark a division within the group. Now, regarding the role of the Philippines and President Marcos, well, Of course, it's amazing that after 30 plus years since the people power revolution against the Marcos dictatorship, they're back in power. Their return to power was fueled largely by authoritarian nostalgia, the failure to consolidate democracy in those decades, and of course, disinformation and disinformation. So, nonetheless, Marcos has been elected president, so he wants to have some performance legitimacy. So he needs to deliver both on the domestic front and to project himself in the region. So that explains his interest. And this is a huge departure from the posturing of the Philippines under Duterte, who really kept everything within the domestic, particularly in his bloody war. So, yeah, that could ask that's it. Existentialist threat. ASEAN.
Thanks, July. It's great to see you in London post COVID on the other side of everything. I think it has been an existential crisis for ASEAN since early last year, and the recognition that it would be an existential crisis for ASEAN is what led Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia in particular, and to only a slightly lesser extent, the Philippines under President Duterte, to take the crisis very seriously, to hold that extraordinary meeting at ASEAN headquarters in April 2021. And I think most people didn't give ASEAN much of a chance, and ASEAN has surprised people. Most people thought that Manang Klein would continue to attend the ASEAN meetings. And I think the key thing that turned it around for ASEAN is that over the last 20 years, ASEAN has built up this role in the regional diplomatic architecture where it is the chair and hosting all the really important diplomatic meetings in East Asia, where China comes, the United States comes, Russia comes, and it gives ASEAN an influence over great power competition that it would not otherwise have. And they knew that if Manang Klein was there at the table, they risked losing that for good. That the Quad and other regional arrangements would reorient themselves. So I think as a result, they took the decision, Brunei, really the Sultan of Brunei, took the decision to exclude Manang Klein from ASEAN meetings starting in October last year. And then under Malaysian pressure, Cambodia agreed to exclude the junta's foreign minister from ASEAN foreign minister meetings, which are a key decision-making body for ASEAN in January of this year, February of this year. And I think we may see further exclusions like that because they are so interested in protecting the centrality of ASEAN. And so because of that, because ASEAN leaders value that centrality, whatever outside analysts may think of it, that actually does motivate ASEAN to take action on this crisis in a way that they might not otherwise be motivated to take action. It's not that Thailand or Vietnam or Laos are so concerned about the human rights situation or democracy in Myanmar. Although, as I said earlier, I think they are embarrassed by the level of depravity of the violence. It is that they care very much about this capital that they have built up, this diplomatic capital that they have built up. And so that does motivate them to be harder on the junta. And so I would not rule out ASEAN continuing to get harder on the junta over time. Again, I think elections are a really big test for ASEAN, and it's one that ASEAN may not pass because there are some member states who will want to say, okay, this resets everything, let's go back to normal. But I would not rule out the possibility that, if the United Kingdom as a dialogue partner of ASEAN, or the United States or the European Union say, we're not going to come to your meetings if you have generals there who have killed thousands of their people, I would not rule out that having a very motivating effect on ASEAN going forward.
Would it make any difference if ASEAN is excluding Myanmar or de facto suspending it?
I think what we may see is a sort of gradual path toward a de facto suspension. Again, I don't think they'll ever use that term. They'll never come out and say Myanmar is de facto suspended, right? And so it's a kind of distinction without a difference for some of them. Malaysia would very much like to see not just a suspension, but also a specific end game, as they call it. They want to say Malaysian Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah, who may not be in office for very much longer because Malaysia has elections coming up. There may be a new government very soon. Minister Saifuddin, I think, would like to say the only thing that will restore stability in Myanmar is holding genuinely democratic elections and restoring the democratically elected government. Therefore, not because I'm pro-democracy, but therefore, because we all want stability, ASEAN should make that the end game in Myanmar. That is, I think, a bridge too far, particularly for Thailand and for the other mainland countries who don't want to set for any other ASEAN member state a particular goal for a style of governance, even though democracy is in the ASEAN Charter. And so I think that's, sorry, human rights is in the ASEAN Charter. So I think that is, yeah, but it's very useful for to have Psychedin so out in the front because it makes Singapore and Indonesia and Brunei and the Philippines under Duterte, it makes them the sort of the median position. So instead of it being just a battle between mainland countries wanting to do less, maritime countries wanting to do more, you also then have Myanmar, who's so far out in front that it makes those maritime countries the median position. And ASEAN's generally, when it comes to a consensus on a difficult issue, assumes a median position. So it's actually quite useful, I think, for Singapore and Indonesia to have Psychedin so far out in front of them because it increases their leverage.
I guess to end, if possible, in a more positive note, as you mentioned, Shona, the intractable root causes of conflict and the differences and the diversity by region or by. But is there any, any hope for some of those causes, root causes to be addressed in some fashion, particularly at the long term, because I would say that even beyond this moment in the history of Myanmar.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I should have mentioned earlier when talking about the actors that the EAOs have, fought in Myanmar for a very long time. I think the oldest running conflict, which is the Karen National Union, their conflict dates back to 1949, which is just a few months after Myanmar's independence. So we're really talking about a country where big parts of the territory and big parts of the population just have never really had that much contact with the central government and who do not consider themselves as part of the nation state in the same way. And I think perhaps what is really hopeful about the present moment is simply that these things are up for debate for the first time. I think we saw in the decade kind of so-called liberalization between 2011 and 2021 that there was huge optimism regarding democracy in Myanmar, but that many kind of non-Burma people or the EAOs felt left out of these conversations because the discussion was so focused around reforming the central state rather than true inclusiveness or really trying to comprehend the country's diversity. So I think for the first time in Myanmar's history, we see an effort, which, as you say, is going to be arduous, but nonetheless it exists, an effort and an appetite to discuss these root problems and to come up with a shared solution. I think kind of people's opinions towards armed resistance have also changed. And I don't want to condone violence, but in fact, this has been a big factor in the exclusion of EAOs or in perceptions of EAOs in Myanmar politics in the past. There was often the perception of, why can't you become a political party and run for elections? Why are you choosing the route of armed resistance when we have a democracy? And I think this conflict has really reframed things in that it has created an environment where EAOs' goals and the ways in which they seek to achieve it are seen as more legitimate and worth engaging with, rather than being shunted aside as kind of terrorists or as illegitimate kind of armies. So I think that the conflict has created a new opening. I guess that is the hope, in spite of all these other quite awful things that are happening in Myanmar.
What then is the future of federalism in Myanmar?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in regards to federalism, so perhaps for those who are not very familiar with what's happening in Myanmar at the moment, I think the National Unity Government or the shadow government is really framing the future of Myanmar as kind of in terms of federalism. And by that, they refer to things like power sharing and making sure that different ethnic people and ethnic states have a stake in the country. And now I say ethnic people and ethnic states because I think the precise format in which federalism will happen has not really been decided. And that has always been a bit of a kind of, I guess, how can I, kind of detracting factor, I suppose, in discussions of federalism in Myanmar, that it was often an ideal that many people aspired to, even before the coup, but people could not really decide what it meant. However, I think the military in the past was often a big spoiler in discussions of federalism. They refused to talk about it in the peace process. And so now that so many groups in Myanmar can agree, at the very minimum, that the military is a common enemy, that creates a space for at least holding these discussions. And perhaps having disagreements in the open is part of that process of deciding what federalism means, right? And I think more generally in Myanmar, there's always been this tension of, especially now, of wanting a future that's inclusive, but not wanting to decide what that meant yet until people could be, until that discussion could be opened up. So there's always this kind of push and pull between, wanting to create a better future, but not wanting to decide it for everyone else. And we see that play out a lot in kind of higher and higher levels these days.
And I would just add, and building on that point, I think it's not just the change that we've seen in terms of the attitude of Bamar, especially youth, toward ethnic armed groups or to ethnic minorities, but it's also the change in attitude we've seen more broadly among Bamar people and Bamar youth in particular, toward a whole range of issues about how you organize a society and how you organize a democracy. And under the NLD government, those conversations really were not happening because the NLD under Aung San Suu Kyi determined how that group, that faction within society was going to approach their politics. And after Aung San Suu Kyi was jailed, and after many NLD leaders were jailed, Bamar youth had to figure that out for themselves, and they came to much more liberal answers than their elders did. And so there's been a kind of, under extraordinarily difficult, violent circumstances, there has been an opening up and a liberalization of debate amongst those who oppose the junta that I think will have long-term consequences for how Bamar people will advocate organizing Myanmar society in the future when they eventually return to power. And that is an unalloyed positive element. This would have happened anyways, as the older generation gave way to a younger generation, but it is happening very rapidly. And it is genuinely a revolution in how they think about their politics and their identity as Myanmar people. And so I think that is really the opportunity. Many in the international community thought the NLD government period was the opportunity to really move Myanmar toward a more stable, more peaceful, more democratic future. I think actually it wasn't as much of an opportunity as they thought it was, because the NLD was not, in fact, very liberal. It was, in fact, actually had some very authoritarian tendencies, especially in terms of its internal governance. If you are interested in those goals, and IISS doesn't take a position on how countries organize themselves internally, but if you are interested in those goals, and most Western countries say that they are, this is actually the opportunity, not the 2016 to 2021 period.
That's actually a great way to conclude. Unless anyone has more questions.
I have one question.
Please go ahead.
You said before that the ongoing fight is not only for resources and power, but also information. And we were just talking about youth and how the societal discounts have increased. How is that happening today? Like, how is the access of information in the youth in particular? And what is there any prospect that can really change or improve the situation?
Thank you for the question. I think that in terms of access to information, the first thing I will say is that as researchers, it's incredibly difficult to go to the country. I mean, we can't be there and conduct ground research, but and so it's hard to ascertain how much people in the country can access information, especially in areas where there have been not just internet cuts, but cuts of mobile services. So we have no idea kind of what information people can access and how. However, as Aaron pointed out, I think even though there has been immense violence, I think there has also been an opportunity, also in the realm of education and political education and information. And where that is happening is often in exile. So the coup, after the coup, we have seen a lot of kind of, this speaks what Javad said earlier as well, a lot of people fleeing across the Thai border. So Myanmar shares a very long land border with Thailand. So people becoming undocumented migrants were living kind of in these cities. And that is actually where new opportunities are also arising. The border has for many years played host to different covert humanitarian organizations working in Myanmar who were banned by previous governments, but that scene has kind of blossomed again since the coup. And among those organizations are new initiatives to create a dialogue around what the future of Myanmar will look like, and new debates about how young people can participate. So we see also that these include online education initiatives, and with that, they try to reach people in the country who still have access to the internet, who can participate kind of covertly in these seminars and these initiatives, and therefore gain access to these debates in a way that they wouldn't before, or where there wasn't an appetite for.
Yeah, and I just recommend taking a look at Shona's analysis of the Dry Zone, where she's outlined some of the communications blackouts and tactics the SAC has used to try to limit the flow of communication of information to people in Myanmar, and then also the Southeast Myanmar analysis, which goes through some of those. So those are both on the Myanmar Conflict Map platform, which is myanmar.iiss.org. So you can look them up on the analysis tab there. But I would just say, I think this is the access to information that we saw young people achieve during the 10 years of liberalization from 2011 to 2021. Factor in what I spoke about earlier, this broader, more cosmopolitan attitude that their elders didn't really have, but they grew up in a much more open society, and that has been, a necessary ingredient to that kind of more open discussion about where Myanmar should go in the future. That I think will have those long-term consequences.
Thanks, Aaron. And I guess before we end, just to remind you that the map is a live map, right? So it's constantly updated with new content as well. And also a little bit of self-promotion. We're going to be releasing the next Armed Conflict Survey 2022 on November 18 in our event in Manama. So we'll be covering, of course, Myanmar and other 32 active conflicts across the world. So we're looking forward to get your feedback on the book. And with that, thank you very much for people who made the effort to come to our house, and to the people who followed us virtually. Thanks so much to Aaron coming from Singapore and Shona from Zurich. And we'll see you very soon in the next video. Thanks so much.